Now that we've seen how the structure and content of the first division of Hosea focuses on judgment and hope from God, and how the second division deals with God's unfolding judgment, we should turn to the third major division of our book, Hosea's prophecies about unfolding hope from God in chapter 9, verse 10, through chapter 14, verse 8. We speak of this division as unfolding because Hosea drew, once again, from prophecies he'd received over many years. And we speak of it as hope because it emphasizes how God's people could continue to have hope for God's blessings even after they'd suffered so severely under His judgment.
In the second division of his book, Hosea dealt almost exclusively with God's judgment against Israel and Judah. If Hosea had stopped his book there, crucial questions would have gone unanswered. Did the troubles Israel and Judah faced mean that God would no longer bless His people in the future? Were God's people to be lost forever? Hosea wrote the third division of his book to answer these kinds of questions. Here he revealed to Judah's leaders in the days of Hezekiah why they should still hope for God's blessings in the future.
The third division of Hosea is the most complex portion of our book because Hosea combined a number of prophecies and even snippets of prophecies together. But on a large scale, we can say with confidence that it divides into 5 main sections, each of which is introduced by a comparison God made with Israel. God compared Israel with fruit in chapter 9, verses 10 through 12, with a planted palm in chapter 9, verses 13 through 17, with a luxuriant vine in chapter 10, verses 1 through 10, with a trained calf in chapter 10, verses 11 through 15, and finally, with a beloved child, or son, in chapter 11, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 8. These sections elaborate on these comparisons in multiple ways, and we'll look into these elaborations more in our next lesson. But in this introductory lesson, time will only allow us to point out a simple pattern of hope that appears at the beginning of each section. As we approach this division of Hosea, it's important to identify as much as possible when Hosea first received the revelations of each of these sections. Some of these historical contexts are more easily identified than others, but on the whole, Hosea retraced the same historical periods that he covered in the second division of his book. As we've seen, Hosea focused the second division on God's judgments during Assyria's invasion in 732 BC and Assyria's invasion in 722 BC. But in the third division of our book, rather than focusing on judgment, this section represents God's words of hope over the same stretch of time. Let's see how this is true by turning first to God's comparison of Israel to fruit in chapter 9, verses 10 through 12. It's most likely that this first section was revealed to Hosea along with other earlier prophecies about Assyria's invasion in 732 BC. The best evidence for this historical setting appears in chapter 9, verse 11. Because Israel's kings had turned from God, we read that Ephraim's glory, literally their glory, or kevodam in Hebrew, shall fly away like a bird. God was about to remove Israel's glory. The only other time in Hosea's book that God predicted this was in God's earlier lawsuit in chapter 4, verses 1 through 19, a section associated with Hosea's earlier prophecies about the 732 BC invasion. In chapter 4, verse 7, God said, "I will change their glory into shame." This link strongly suggests that Hosea began the third division of his book as he began the second, with one of his earlier prophecies about Assyria's invasion in 732 BC. This setting is confirmed by the fact that these verses make no reference to Judah. As you'll recall, Uzziah and Jotham ruled as righteous kings, and God pronounced no curses on Judah during this time. With this historical orientation in mind, listen to what God said in chapter 9, verse 10. Like grapes in the wilderness I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season I saw your fathers. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to the thing of shame, and became detestable like the thing they loved. Clearly, God spoke of Israel's sins in this verse, but it's important to note that God began with a positive comparison of Israel with grapes and figs. So even as God determined to bring judgment against Israel in 732 BC, He still remembered Israel fondly as one remembers sweet fruits. And God's positive memory reassured God's people that there was still hope for them to return to His blessings in the future. The second section in chapter 9, verses 13 through 17, focuses on Israel as a planted palm and follows a similar pattern. We can't be sure when Hosea first received this revelation, but on the whole, Hosea's description of Israel fits well with the conditions of Israel when Hosea received prophecies about Assyria's invasion in 732 BC. This historical orientation is supported by the fact that this passage does not mention Judah. So, it most likely came to Hosea before Ahaz turned Judah away from God. Listen to the opening of this section in chapter 9, verse 13. Ephraim, as I have seen, was like a young palm planted in a meadow, but Ephraim must lead his children out to slaughter. Here God threatened Israel with the slaughter of their children as they went out to battle against Assyrian invaders. But as terrible as this judgment was, in the first half of this verse, God remembered how He cherished Israel like a young palm planted in a meadow. God's fond memory of them revealed that there was still hope for God's blessings to come to Israel in the future. After focusing on Israel as a planted palm, Hosea compared the kingdom of Israel to a luxuriant vine in chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. In all likelihood, this section also originated when Hosea received prophecies about Assyria's invasion in 732 BC. Chapter 10, verse 6 threatens that the wealth of Israel's worship centers will be carried off as tribute to the great king, the same king mentioned in chapter 5, verse 13. This great king was Tiglath-Pileser III, who led the devastating invasion of 732 BC. But it's important to note that Judah is not mentioned in this section. So this may indicate that Ahaz had not yet led Judah into corruption. In this light, listen to what God said in chapter 10, verse 1. Israel is a luxuriant vine. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. Notice here that Hosea's prophecy focused again on judgment against Israel, because the more they prospered, the more altars they built. Israel had filled their tribal territories with altars to other gods, and they would suffer God's judgment for this rebellion. But as before, Hosea introduced this threat of judgment with the fact that God remembered Israel as a delightful, luxuriant vine. This comparison offered hope for God's blessings on Israel in the future. After likening Israel to a luxuriant vine, Hosea wrote about God's comparison of the kingdom of Israel to a trained calf in chapter 10, verses 11 through 15. This section may have originated when Hosea received his earlier prophecies about Assyria's invasion in 722 BC. As we've seen, during this time, King Hosea led Israel into idolatry and injustice. And early on, he relied on his alliance with Assyria and its gods for his security instead of God. Because of this, God warned that curses were coming to Israel. The most notable evidence for the historical setting of this section is that it mentions the sins of Judah. As we know, Ahaz, the king of Judah, had promoted idolatry and injustice throughout Judah. He also persisted in seeking help from his alliance with Assyria rather than from God. So in chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, God briefly threatened curses against Judah and announced that Judah must plow and sow righteousness. This entire section begins in chapter 10, verse 11, with these words: Ephraim was a trained calf that loved to thresh, and I spared her fair neck, but I will put Ephraim to the yoke. We see here that God threatened to put Ephraim to the yoke, a metaphor for the judgment of oppression by Assyria. But despite the judgment that was coming, God still remembered Israel fondly as a trained calf that loved to thresh. And God's positive remembrance of Israel served as the basis of hope for the future. This brings us to the last comparison in this division on unfolding hope from God, by far the longest section in the third division. In chapter 11, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 8, God compared his people to something even more precious than a well-trained calf, a beloved child or son. This lengthy section represents revelations Hosea received when he delivered his prophecies about Assyria's invasion in 722 BC. At this time, King Hosea continued to lead Israel in idolatry and injustice. But later, he attempted to break free of Assyria by foolishly seeking an alliance with Egypt. God specifically addressed this alliance in chapter 11, verse 5, where he said that Israel will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria shall be their king. This historical context is confirmed by the fact that in chapter 11, verse 12, and chapter 12, verses 2 through 6, Hosea also prophesied against Judah. As we read in chapter 12, verse 2, the Lord has an indictment against Judah. Despite the reforms that Hezekiah was able to achieve, Hezekiah relied on his own strength and turned to an alliance with Egypt rather than turning to the Lord. So Judah suffered the judgment of God through Sennacherib's invasion in 701 BC. Now listen to the opening of this section in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. These opening verses present Hosea's pattern once again. Israel had sinned against God. Time and again, God called to them, but they went away and worshipped Baals and idols. And as a result, judgment was coming. But even as God pronounced judgment, verse 1 indicates that God still thought of Israel as his beloved son. And his love for his child Israel was the basis of hope for Israel's future blessings.
Hosea 11:1 speaks of how God called Israel out of Egypt. The verses go on to say that God bent down and lovingly fed them and provided for his people, and yet the more he called to his people through his servants the prophets, the further that they went from him. And so God declares that he's going to send them away, only this time not to Egypt, but Assyria will be their king. But then the chapter goes on with God's voice breaking with his love for his people, and God declaring, I will not execute my fierce judgment on Israel. I will call, and my sons will come trembling like birds from the land of Egypt, like doves from the land of Assyria. I will gather them again to this land, and I will again be their God, and they will again be my people.
Now, there's much more to the third division of Hosea than our brief introduction reveals, and we'll look more closely at this part of our book in our next lesson. Still, we've seen enough to grasp the heart of the matter. Hosea composed this last division of his book to impart wisdom to Judah's leaders after Israel had fallen to Assyria and most of its citizens had been carried off into exile. And in these last chapters of his book, Hosea drew from prophecies he had given throughout his ministry to strengthen Judah's hopes for what God had promised. Judgment was not the end of Israel's story because God had never forgotten how much he cherished them. The leaders of Judah could gain wisdom and hold firmly to the hope of blessings to come. In this introduction to Hosea, we've explored the background of Hosea by distinguishing between the time, location, circumstances, and purpose of the prophet's ministry and his book. We've also surveyed the content and structure of the book of Hosea by noting how the prophet gave those who first received his book wisdom by focusing on judgment and hope, unfolding judgment, and unfolding hope from God.
The book of Hosea was written to teach wisdom when Israel and Judah faced one of the most difficult times in their history, the crisis of Assyrian judgment. And his book gives insights that God's people need in every age, including our own as we look toward the future. Like Israel and Judah in the days of Hosea, followers of Christ must heed Hosea's call to pursue wisdom as we face the trials of this world. From his book, we can see that no matter what difficulties we face, even when all seems lost, we can hold firmly to the hope for the future that we have in Christ. And we can be confident that one day God will pour out immeasurable blessings on his people when Christ returns in glory.